Hey everybody, happy Wednesday, and I'm really excited about this video. I'm pretty much excited most of the time, but this is a really cool one because I'm going to be sharing with you a really interesting, kind of quirky method that I have for helping myself, learn, take in, digest, assimilate, and most of all, remember information, and especially when I'm learning languages. Although I also use this method with things like reading nonfiction books. Anytime I'm trying to learn information, it's also very helpful for immersive experiences with language learning. So first of all, I have this little helper method that I use, but I'm especially excited because this video is in fact based on a previous episode where I discussed the importance of sleep in language learning. So that was a 2-part episode. I highly recommend you watch it. And I basically spent a ton of time reading into the research behind how sleep impacts language learning. And there was one piece of research in there that blew my mind, and I felt like it really validated this incredibly simple technique that I have for learning things in language learning. So without further ado, let's jump in. But if you haven't seen those 2 videos, I highly recommend doing that first, because I'm going to be referencing certain research in this video that I explain in full in that other episode. Okay, so I have 2 sort of versions of this method. The first one is very much implicit, and it's something that I actually do mostly in my head. And I call this mental stickies. Now, in case you're a second, language learner of English, stickies are sticky notes. They're these yellow little, sticky notes you put on things, right? So the idea behind sticky notes is they're just quick things, right? You just pull it off, you write it down, you come back to it later, you throw it away when you're done with it, right? So I love this idea of mental stickies, and I'll explain why in just a second. But the other version of this method I have is far more explicit, right? So I actually physically mark things down. So I'm going to now explain to you in very broad terms the research that prompted this video. Then I will show you the sort of explicit physical version of the method. And then finally, I will explain my mental stickies at the end. So again, I did explain the entire research study in that part 2 of the sleep series, but for now I'll just explain very briefly that there was a study that was done. And it was done by Matthew Walker, who is the author of the book Why We Sleep, which I reference heavily in those videos. And him and a graduate student, they performed an exam on some participants where they gave them a list of vocabulary, right? So essentially it was a vocab test, but the interesting thing was that every single word that the participants saw when they were learning the list, it either had a big green R for remember, or a big red F to indicate forget, right? So essentially, it's just learning a list of words, but there's a signal to tell the learner, remember this one, forget this one, right? So they had 2 groups, and what happened is, after they had the learning session, one group got to have a nap. So they actually went to sleep, and the other group were kept awake. They were surfing the internet, doing very, menial things. And then at the end of the day, both groups were tested on the vocab list. Now, the fascinating finding was that it turned out, we already know that sleep impacts our ability to learn things. When we sleep, it strengthens our memories as we sort of transfer information from the short-term hippocampus to the long-term cortex. And once again, I explained that whole process in those other videos. But what was really interesting is that having the signals, the big green R for remember and the big red F, it actually impacted the specific words that sleep helped to strengthen the memory of. So the group that did not sleep, they just had a pretty average, they remembered some, they forgot some. There was nothing very special about the words they remembered versus forgot. But the group that slept, the words tagged with the big green R, they remembered them at a much higher rate. And furthermore, the words tagged with the big red F for forget, they actually did forget those words at a much higher rate. And surprisingly, the results of this research were they were confident. They thought this is clearly demonstrative of sleep, impacting our learning ability, but it also showed that we have the ability to tell our brain essentially, please help me remember this, but please don't help me remember this. And so this brings me to my little method that I have. I don't know how original this is. I certainly didn't get this from anybody else, but it's very possible that it's, widely known. But essentially, when I'm studying a textbook, right? Let's say I'm reading a nonfiction book, I'm trying to learn something, or maybe I'm doing a Babbel lesson. Many of you know that I love the app Babbel. I'm gonna show you some notes in a second. By the way, I do have an affiliate link for Babbel because I do love it so much and I'm always talking about it. So if you wanna try it out, I have a link in the description, full disclosure. So when I'm doing a Babbel lesson, I'm constantly copying my favorite phrases, favorite sentences. Anything I see that I think, I want to remember this. This is fantastic. This is a great phrase. Or like, oh, this is a really interesting grammatical pattern. Or, oh, I like how they used the passive voice here. I don't know. Anything that I see as I'm going through those lessons and I think, I want that, right? I want that in my memory. I want to be able to use that in my spoken language. Well, I copy those phrases over. So let's actually jump in to my laptop and I'll show you exactly what I mean. So this is Notion, and I made a whole video recently with a tutorial about how to build your own language learning workspace inside of Notion. So I have this little, sheet here. I've shown it before, and this is what I was talking about. So when I'm going through my Babbel lessons, every time I see a phrase where I'm like, ooh, I like this, or oh, that's a really good word, right? I copy it and I paste it into this table. So I already find that just this act of, extracting the bits that I really want to learn and putting them in a table, that already helps me. Just that little bit of extra effort, it really seems to deepen the cognitive process just a bit. And it's just enough to, really help myself remember, yes, these are things I want to remember. But I actually go one step further. So you'll notice here, right, we have a few phrases because I do always prefer to have an entire phrase. I don't like to just learn words in isolation. So having a phrase is great because it gives me context, but I still want to go a step further and I want to actually tag the specific part of that phrase that I'm most interested in. So for example, let's say, this here. So, aber willst du dir eine Nachspeise mit mir teilen? Right? So, but do you want to share a dessert with me? The reason why I grabbed this sentence is because we have this mit mir, right? I wanted to remember because we have in German, various different endings, various different noun cases, right? And so I wanted to remember specifically that after the word mit, it's always mir, dir, right? So I copied it in and I highlighted with me, right? Now in this case, how about the apple strudel with vanilla sauce? Well, the reason why I grabbed this is because this is quite interesting. This wie wäre es mit einem Apfelstrudel mit Vanillesoße, right? Wie wäre es? Because if you think about it in a language that you're learning, do you know how to say, how about this? How about that? Maybe you do, but I didn't feel super confident in German, and that's a grammatical structure I could use over and over and over again, so I grabbed it. But once again, the important thing is, I specifically highlighted the piece of information that I most want to learn. And so for me, this is very similar to what was done in that research study that I told you about, right? What I'm doing here is first of all, I'm deepening the cognitive process because I'm not just simply seeing a phrase, moving on. I'm actually seeing a phrase and I'm interacting with the parts that I find most interesting. But then I'm also creating a signal. I am tagging the specific things that I want to remember. And I believe this is very, very similar once again to the big green R or the big red F. Now, I now want to go on to a small thing I do when I read books. So when I'm reading a book, and this could be a nonfiction book, I recently gave the example of a machine learning book that I'm reading. And I'm just gonna show you quickly on the screen that when I read a book, I do this thing where I actually just highlight every sentence, every piece of information that I'm most interested in, I highlight it. And I don't know why, because it only takes me an extra second, but there's something very powerful about this method of highlighting sentences and bits of info that I want to remember. Now with this, I go a step further and I actually color code my highlights, right? So yellow will tend to be just general pieces of information. Orange usually is like definitions, right? So the definition of a particular thing. Blue is usually quotations, things that I'm like, ooh, I like this. But so again, what I'm doing here is I am tagging information, and it helps me to just, I often don't even go back and review it. There's just something about this act of taking that really short amount of time to just tag information that I want to remember. It really seems to help me. Now, let's transition to this idea of mental stickies, right? So it's basically the same thing, but it's all done inside my head. So when I'm out and about, and let's say that I'm in Spain and I'm out actually in this immersive environment and I'm, talking to people, I am just constantly collecting data points, right? So every time I hear somebody talk, I'm listening to what they're saying, and every time I hear something interesting, right? Something that reinforces what I already know, a brand new phrase, maybe a sentence that I understood but I'd never heard it that way, anything that I think, I want that, right? That's what I want. It's a split second, but in my head, I tag it, right? I take this extra half second to just make a mental sticky note and say, that's really, really helpful. I want to remember that. I really like that word. That's fantastic, right? And it might seem so simple, but I do it constantly, and all throughout the day, it's like I'm just collecting thousands and thousands of data points, right? And so you might think, okay, that one little half-second mental sticky note, that's not gonna help you remember it. But of course, as you get mass exposure and you start to see the same things over and over again, I believe that this accumulation of mental stickies, it really, really helps me to remember things more effectively, especially when it's paired with the more explicit version of tagging information that you want to remember. Now, in the same way, remember that the study showed we can also dictate the things that we forget. And what's really happening, to the best of our knowledge, it's not that your brain says, forget that, it's just that your brain avoids strengthening certain memories. So when I'm a beginner and I'm going through, let's say, Babbel, I think Babbel is pretty good about this, but even Babbel, they do this thing. But Duolingo, different apps, there's always a section where they start teaching you words like dishwasher, microwave, washing machine, aubergine, butternut squash, onions, right? And I'm sorry, at that stage, as a beginner, I just don't care. I personally, I really value the mental real estate that I have. And, when you're a beginner, I feel like it takes a lot more cognitive load to remember things, right? Because everything is so new. So I create mental stickies, right? When I see the word microwave, I'm not interested. So I'll listen, right? And if there's a quiz, I'll do whatever it takes to just get to the next lesson in the app, whatever it is, right? But I specifically make a mental note to myself, like, I'm not interested in microwave. I'm not interested in aubergine or whatever it is, eggplant, I'll learn that stuff later if it's important, right? But for now, I want to know the core words, the most common phrases. I want to get my head around the grammar. I want to get being able to say a lot of things with a little bit of language. And so aubergine and microwave, they're not part of that for me. Now, again, I wasn't really thinking that this was actually effective, but once again, based on that study, I believe that is in fact helpful. Again, it's just this extremely quick process of making these mental stickies as you go through your day, whether it's immersed in a language environment or whether it's just doing a textbook or doing an app or watching a movie. Anytime you get a chance, I do it all the time, all throughout the day. I just, sticky note. I like that. Don't want that. And that's basically it. So I hope that's not too underwhelming. I just love it because it's so simple. Like I said, it's not a standalone method, but it's just a little helper technique that you can use all throughout the day. You can combine this with anything you're doing, and based on that research, I really think that this is surprisingly effective. Okay, there you go. I'm really curious to know what you think. I think this is a really cool little technique, but let me know your thoughts, and if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing, liking, and maybe even joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Robin MacPherson. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you back here on Friday.